Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Librarian Diane Dahoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And many thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel, and to the State Journal for always giving us great additional publicity. I'd like to remind everyone that you can find flyers with the fall 2025 spring season of the lecture series printed in the back, and you can find the schedule on the library's website and videos of past lectures on Cable 10's YouTube channel. If you're not already but want to keep up with the lecture series, be sure to follow the library's Facebook page. And we're very excited to have our speaker here this evening. After serving as its Director of Collections and Research, Dr. Patrick Lewis was installed as President CEO of the Filson Historical Society in January. He was set to be our first speaker in January, and I think we were scheduled to be one of his first speaking engagements as president, but we unfortunately had to reschedule because of the weather. As you may remember, in December, Dr. Dan Gifford's book, Benefactors of Posterity, was released last year to commemorate the Filson's 140th anniversary, and we had Dr. Gifford here to present on his book and provide part one of the history of the Filson, if you will. That story took us from its founding, including Colonel Reuben T. Durrett, Thomas Speed, Frankfort's John Mason Brown, Ida Symes, and many others. Dr. Lewis is here to fill in the years where Dr. Gifford's book left off, around 1899, to bring us to the present and to provide the vision for the future of the Filson and the history of history professions in general in Kentucky. And so without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Librarian Diane Dahoney to introduce today's speaker.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, John. As he mentioned, my name is Diane Dahoney. I am the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. And on behalf of everyone here, we just want to thank you for coming out and spending your evening with us and coming out to this pop-up lecture. As John said, we're so happy that Dr. Lewis was able to reschedule it with us. So we appreciate your flexibility there. Mother Nature had other plans for us this winter, as you well know. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Patrick Lewis. He is the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. He came to the Filson in 2019 as served as the Director of Collections and Research and co-editor of the Ohio Valley History Journal. A Trigg County native, he graduated from Transylvania University and holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Kentucky, where he taught for 2 years. Before coming to the Filson, he worked for the National Park Service and the Kentucky Historical Society. He has won grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the James Graham Brown Foundation. Lewis is the author of For Slavery and Union, Benjamin Buckner and Kentucky Loyalties in the Civil War, and co-editor of Playing at War, Identity and Memory in Civil War Video Games. Please help me to welcome to the podium Dr. Patrick Lewis.
Thanks for the fantastic introductions, and I was joking with some of y'all before we got started tonight that this is still one of my first presentations after becoming president and CEO, and we will see how good a historian I still am. Because I've been doing a lot of not historian-like things, but this is really a topic that I love, that I've been passionate about since I was here at KHS for almost a decade, and really kind of bouncing between UK and KHS and now the Filson, spending a lot of my time entrenched inside KDLA, scanning documents for the Civil War Governors of Kentucky project, and being a University Press of Kentucky author, I really feel that this era that I'm going to talk about was so important in establishing the kind of the institutional footprint that allows us to keep talking about Kentucky history. If it wasn't for the people that we're going to talk about tonight, some of the good ideas, like the Filson Club at the time that Reuben Durrett and some other Louisvillians had, or the various iterations of the Kentucky Historical Society that had come and gone by the turn of the 20th century, we would not have had this really admirable, kind of landscape environment of history, archival, and publishing institutions that help tell Kentucky's story. And having, personal connections with a lot of these, I think these are just some reflections on some people that I really like. I'm really glad that we mentioned Dan Gifford's book, Benefactors of Posterity. We were so honored to have him write that for us. He did that as an entire donation of his time and talent to the Filson. I've said many times publicly that I can't imagine. Lots of people have written checks to the Filson, and we sure do appreciate those. Time is something that you don't get back and you can't earn. And so we really did appreciate the perspective that he gave us on our own past and going forward into our next 140 years. It really gives us confidence. And in as much as there are some things maybe interpretively that we would differ with Colonel Durrett on, that same vision of having a place where Kentucky historians can come, can do their research, can have the funding and support to publish books that puts Kentucky in the middle of a national conversation about historical importance, that legacy we can really hold on to and cherish, and that's kind of distributed throughout the organizations we're going to talk about tonight. So I start here with this photo that Dan used in his presentation, if you were here for that, of the inside of Colonel Durrett's library. And really quickly, to summarize, in the 1880s, Reuben Durrett and a group of 10 people who were living in Louisville but who had roots from all over the state came together and formed the Filson Club, a private organization that researched, read papers to one another, and financed publications. They continued that through a series of monthly meetings throughout kind of basically the tenure of most of their lives. After the calendar turned over into the 1900s, this group of men starts to pass away. And there are serious questions about whether all this activity and this publication, this research that had gone on for the past 15 years would continue. And in fact, most of the contents of the library that you're looking at in Durrett's house, about a year and a half before his death, were all sold to the University of Chicago. They came down to Louisville as Durrett was aging and ailing and said, look, there's nowhere in Louisville that can take all of this stuff after you die. The Filson didn't have a building. The Filson didn't have staff. It didn't have its own collection. It was just basically a sort of a network of private libraries and support. And the Louisville Free Public Library doesn't have a space big enough to hold all of this on top of everything else that it has. There is no Kentucky Historical Society. So we will buy this. We have graduate students at the University of Chicago, and not only that, we're close to Northwestern. Not only that, we're close to the University of Wisconsin. All of these American history Ph.D. students can benefit from the material that you have here. And so off it went to Chicago, where it still remains today, with the exception of some of the artifacts and portraits that you see up there, which you can still see if you come to the Filson today. So, I wanted to turn the focus, before I get back to kind of the successors at the Filson, I want to turn our attention to Frankfort. And I want to highlight this guy whose papers are at the Filson, but who primarily lived here in Frankfort in the second half of his life. This is Ed Porter Thompson. He was a Confederate veteran from South Central Kentucky, originally joined the 6th Kentucky Infantry in the Orphan Brigade, was wounded fairly early and kind of disabled from active service, but he remained a brigade quartermaster and followed the orphans through the end. And as the war was very clearly winding down in the kind of the winter and spring of 1865, he started to assemble what would become in 1868 the history of the 1st Kentucky Brigade, which is a massive tome. There's probably one in this building here. And it was a narrative history of not all of Kentucky's Confederate troops, but those regiments that made up the core of the Orphan Brigade, the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 9th Kentucky Infantry Regiments, and a couple of associated artillery batteries, that not only told the stories of kind of what they did during the war, but also importantly included a full roster and directory in the back, which was actually the majority of the page count. And this was an absolutely mind-blowing work of tracking down all these men who, after the surrender, had scattered on back to their homes, drifted on back after they'd been wounded or sometimes deserted, and come back to Kentucky. And yet he was able to assemble current addresses of all the ones that were still living, and their complete record of battles that they fought in. I argue that most of what Thompson did was not historical, but he was a Democratic political party operative of the highest order. He's a newspaper man by his day job. So he was really thinking of this as a directory of any Democratic politician, of a bunch of reliable voters that they could call up if they happened to be running for office. It's an absolutely astounding piece of work that would not see a sort of a duplicate effort by any other Confederate state or military unit until well into the 1880s. He ran for superintendent of public instruction in the late 1880s up against another Orphan Brigade veteran and lost. And then after that, he was appointed by Simon Bolivar Buckner, who was governor at the time, to be the state librarian. Now, this was not a prestigious position. This was had become a patronage position for a good, reliable Confederate widow. And Roger W. Hanson, who had been commander of the Orphan Brigade, killed at the Battle of Stones River, his widow had been the state librarian if you go over to the old state capitol, the tiny little library room there on the first floor that kept basically the records for the legislators to peruse. She kind of served that and kept that all neat and tidy. Well, she finally passed away, and so Buckner feels bad for his former comrade, and so appoints Captain Thompson to be the state librarian, and he really takes to it. There's a very interesting moment when he is appointed, because in 1888-89, the Kentucky Historical Society, which, as I mentioned, had kind of flickered in and out of existence at various times, had a brief resurgence in the early 1870s, but it had kind of fallen away again, and Governor Buckner declared it officially defunct. And so Thompson took over what had been the permanent collection of KHS and merged that in with the state library collection, what we would now consider KDLA, and maybe also kind of a function of the Legislative Research Commission as well, if you kind of want to think about the origin of some of the state agencies, but mostly KDLA and KHS collections, and Thompson produces a really complete catalog, this inventory of everything that's in the state library collection. And if you peruse that, you know KHS collections as well as, for some reason, I happen to, you can see a number of really bedrock items that were in there already that he's taken care of. He works with Reuben Durrett, the director of the Filson Club, or the president of the Filson Club, to acquire the library of Kentucky newspaperman and historian Richard Collins, whose kind of multi-volume history of Kentucky was the state of the art at the time, published in the early 1870s. He was falling on financial hard times, needed somebody to sell that library to, and so the state was convinced by Colonel Durrett to intervene and acquire that collection. That collection sits back on shelves that you can't get to at KHS, but in its entirety, cataloged as one single unit still today. So that was work that Ed Porter Thompson did. Unfortunately, all of this active collections management work, this cataloging and finding new shelving for things that had been up in attics of the old state capitol and laying on the floor. He apparently, with all of the ingenuity of any good state bureaucrat, didn't have much budget for furniture and bookshelves, so he broke up a bunch of old desks and chairs and had carpenters kind of whip them up into some crude shelving. There, it probably looks a lot better now than it did in his day, but when it came time to actually elect the new state librarian, because he'd had an interim appointment because Mrs. Hanson had died, the General Assembly said, absolutely not. This guy spent way too much money producing this library catalog. We want nothing to do with that. And so he wasn't reelected. But in 1891, he did finally get elected to be the superintendent of public instruction, which he served for a few years. And then he wrote a children's book of Kentucky history that was designed to go into classrooms. It's really well illustrated. The interpretation is about what you would expect for the 1890s. It ain't great, but the woodcuts are top notch. Check them out. And then he retired and started working on a couple of other Confederate history projects, namely the State Adjutant General's Report. If any of you have ever been doing genealogy of a Confederate Kentucky ancestor, that report that lists in brief all of the men who served in the various Confederate military units, he and his son worked on up until the day he keeled over and died. And he is really a handing off point between this kind of earlier generation and some of the later characters that I'm about to talk about. When he dies in 1903, he had a piece in the first issue of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and his obituary ran in the second. So he sort of lives up to the point where we hand off. The editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, who published both that first piece that Thompson wrote and his obituary, is this lady here, Jenny Chin Morton. This is a portrait of her from KHS collections. Years ago, when I was working for the Civil War Governor's Papers Project, we were annotating everybody who appeared in correspondence to any of the governors. So there was a letter in 1861 to Governor Magoffin on the stationery of a bank in Hartford, Kentucky. And the cashier was one John C. Morton. So I go to look him up. It was one of those things that perplexed me for a little bit, because even though the letter had been written in 1861, he had been dead since 1860. So he was not currently alive, but they hadn't changed out their stationery yet. They're using up their old stock. And so the ghost of John C. Morton lives on. And so I'm looking through vital records and trying to get any scrap of information I can, and the last thing I can find him doing, I don't quite know when he died in 1860 or how, but the last thing I can find him doing is in June marrying this woman, and she is on the Franklin County marriage certificate as Sally J. Chin, and after her husband's death, after what can only have been a couple or 3 months of marriage, she stays out in the plantation of her parents here in Franklin County, and in the 1870s moves in to Frankfort and starts a literary career. She's really most active in writing poetry and fiction and sort of doing the work of a lot of elite white women who are participating in this world of letters because they're formally excluded from lots of the economic and political world. She shifts a little bit. She goes by, instead of Sally J. Chin, she goes by Jenny Chin Morton, and changes her name just a touch. But in the dormancy period of the Kentucky Historical Society, sort of after E.P. Thompson had gotten Governor Buckner to declare that KHS was non-extant and had merged that collection in with the State Library collection, she really starts to argue, starting in about 1896, that Kentucky needs a state historical society. It needs to have a permanent collection and a research library here in Frankfort, and ideally, she would like it to be supported by the state government. So she gets Governor Bradley and some members of the General Assembly to produce a new charter, invalidate the old charters for the previous iterations of the Kentucky Historical Society, and get a new one that starts meeting in 1897, where she's elected the secretary and the treasurer, which was the highest effective office in KHS because the governor, still as today, is the ex officio president. So she was it in terms of the Kentucky Historical Society. And then also later that year, she opened a handful of kind of vacant office rooms in what is now the Old State Capitol Annex as a Kentucky History Museum and Research Library, using a lot of the things that Thompson had gathered together. In about 1901, the membership had demanded a regular publication. They wanted a Kentucky History magazine, which would eventually become the Register, and they wanted state support. And so in 1902, Governor Beckham allowed them the free use of state printing facilities and the use of postage to start mailing out Kentucky history publications all across the state. In 1906, Governor Beckham convinced the legislature to cover about $5,000 of her salary and KHS expenses. And then really importantly, in 1909, as the new state capitol was opening, she convinced the administration to give her a number of rooms over across the river to really expand these displays and keep them open more permanently. So a couple of stats from the librarian's report by Sally Jackson, another KHS employee. They had two at that time. In 1909, the Kentucky Historical Society, again located over in the new Capitol, served about 650 students from 14 schools, mostly in Franklin and surrounding counties, but some from as far away as Madison, Indiana, Richmond, Kentucky, and about 2,000 total visitors from other U.S. states and a handful from Europe, mostly Great Britain. Morton died in 1920, and about 6 months after her death, the state needed more office space over in the new Capitol, and so they decided to devote the old Capitol to the Kentucky Historical Society, where it remained for a very long time, and so they moved over to that space. By 1937, the other statistics that I could find, just a contrast with those from 1909, there were about 3,300 visitors to KHS and about 1,400 students from 45 schools. So again, when you have a larger institutional space, that works out pretty well. I wanted to highlight a little bit here. Well, let's go on a little bit. So this is the rooms in the new state capitol, a colored postcard from the KHS collection. Again, just like you can in Colonel Durrett's library, I love kind of snooping and looking at the portraits and seeing which ones I recognize from walls or collection storage spaces and which pieces are still out. And then this is a mid-century photo of some of the display rooms in the old state capitol. Again, all of these pieces now over in the Thomas D. Clark Center. Well, with the exception of old Zachary Taylor up there. He's still in place. But you can kind of see what Jenny Chin Morton built. I think it's also really fascinating. I'd written a short piece when I was at KHS about the kind of the marriage conundrum and trying to figure out who John C. Morton was and kind of understanding that, oh, that's that Jenny Chin Morton, who, you know, she edited the Register. The Register's a big part of my life. That was a big win for me. I had interpreted her and her independence as a widowed woman who therefore had certain legal protections to live as a femme sole, without being covered in the 19th century legal terminology by her husband, and able to exercise a lot more independence in her decision-making in financial matters. I had interpreted her as kind of living the rest of her life as single. I don't actually think that's the case. Because of some very telling evidence that comes out in her biography, and it has to do with Sally Jackson, that librarian and second employee of the Kentucky Historical Society. This is a piece that is in the KHS collection now. I have not yet found a photo of Sally Jackson. One has to exist, but I just hadn't found it yet. Of a textile that came through Sally Jackson's family. This is a piece that was woven from flax, made into linen, grown on the farm of her grandfather back in Virginia, embroidered by her grandmother, carried across the mountains, and descending down the family line into Frankfort when Sally then gave it into the KHS collection, which I think is just a magnificent testament to women's work for a woman who, again, exercised a great deal of independence and autonomy in turn-of-the-century Kentucky. Just to give you kind of an idea of the kind of the character of Jenny Chin Morton, she was a diehard Confederate and a devoted Southerner. If you look at KHS's early publications and some of the early museum and manuscript acquisitions, it's ladies like her who are really, really closely tied in with the local United Daughters of the Confederacy chapters that build Kentucky's Confederate collections into a top-notch resource for studying Confederate memory. If any of you know Ann Marshall, who wrote the Creating a Confederate Kentucky book, or Carrie Janey, who's a professor at UVA and written extensively on Civil War memory and especially white women in the construction of Confederate memory, they have both attested to me that KHS's Confederate memorial collections are second to none anywhere else in the South, largely due to ladies like Jenny Chin Morton. I pulled a couple of quotes from her obituary because I think they're really fantastic. Gentle of birth, and from earliest girlhood surrounded by the traditions of her Southland, she cherished these as very precious and gave in return a love as warm as summer's suns and pure as blossoms of magnolia. Romance and chivalry, courage and bravery were woven into her life, the blood of her heroes, her heritage, the past nobly transmitted to her. She kept the faith, and great tasks challenged her efforts. But I was really surprised on reading this obituary to see these lines, which, reading between the lines of the sort of the coded descriptions of queer relationships at the turn of the century. Again, there's nothing to prove definitively a relationship between she and Sally Jackson, but if you know where to look, this is smoke that might lead to fire. In that obituary, it said, a few years after moving to Frankfort, she and Miss Sally Jackson, her most intimate friend, perfected a joint housekeeping arrangement, which lasted until Mrs. Morton's death. The friendship of these two, running over a period of more than 40 years without a ripple of discord, well nigh refutes the theory that there is nothing perfect on this earth. No account of Mrs. Morton's life would be complete without reference to the beautiful friendship existing between her and Miss Jackson. Big alarm bells going off there. Similar questions about the peculiar unmarried life surround the Filson's leading figure of the early 20th century, Rogers Clark Ballard Thruston here. Mr. Thruston, as he is fondly remembered around my office, and this portrait hangs just on the opposite wall from where my desk now is, was born into a very wealthy Louisville family, the Ballards, who owned a series of flour mills up and down the Ohio and Mississippi River. Wanting for nothing, attending Northeastern prep schools, eventually Yale, was a huge Yalie, and alumni president for a number of times. Interestingly, right after he graduated from college, by his mother's request, he voluntarily changed his name, flipping his middle and his last names, and going from being a Ballard to a Thruston because her Thruston line did not have any male heirs. And she hoped that he would be able to continue the line. He didn't. Instead, he gave birth to the Filson. He was a mining engineer for the majority of his active career. He traveled all over not only eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, East Tennessee, where we would expect a Kentucky mining engineer to go, but all over the West and even down into Central and South America with various projects. He was also a really, really good and avid amateur photographer. And so we have, tens of thousands of images that he took from all of his global travels, as well as, very interestingly, a number of photos that he took of Kentucky history sites around the turn of the century, just as he would be driving around the state and visiting friends and visiting historic sites. It's really fascinating, especially to look at some of his photos of places that have now been developed, right? That was farmland, that's now a subdivision, or alternatively, sort of rolling back the clock, you can see some historic houses that are now preserved, but they have just god-awful modern accretions on them, and porches and porticos and everything else that were put on in the late 19th century that are now no longer there, but when he's taking photos in 1905 or whatever, you can see them there. So I really love this photo. This is part of his, you can see down there in Harlan County, showing off the size of this coal seam that he's working in, and it makes it seem like this is a really epic vein of coal. But come to find out, he's a tiny little guy, so the scale here is real deceiving. He retires in 1919 and comes back to Louisville. He's gets actively involved in the Filson, really gets bit by the bug of family history. In 1923, he becomes the Filson's president about a decade after Durrett had died and left the organization kind of rudderless. It was a very real possibility that this club that had been meeting monthly to read and share history papers was just kind of going to go away, or might have just sort of existed as a private club and not a professional research library. But Mr. Thruston gets really actively involved in 1929 in a fundraising campaign to build or buy a permanent fireproof building in Louisville. The result of which was the purchase of this building, this old house on Breckenridge Street. It's on First and Breckenridge in Louisville right now. It still says the Filson Club over the top of it, even though it now belongs to Spalding University and is on their campus at the time. So it was nice of them to leave that up there for us. He, of course, hires professionally trained library staff. The Filson starts to assemble its own permanent collection, again, after having kind of had the legs cut out from under us when Durrett sold that collection to the University of Chicago. Mr. Thruston kind of brings that back to life. He was also, as I mentioned, really deeply passionate about any Kentucky history story, especially if it touched a family member of his. And as his two first names, if you remember them, Rogers Clark Ballard Thruston, Thruston Ballard as they were originally, he was the greatest promoter in this state of the legacy of George Rogers Clark. Last year, in 2024, we had the centennial of course, the establishment of Kentucky State Parks, the establishment of Fort Herod in 1774, and Mr. Thruston was a driving force behind establishing that as the first kind of historical interpretive park in the Kentucky State Park system. This is him from his private collection there in 1924. If you can't read it at the bottom, he's dressed up like George Rogers Clark in his buckskins. I think he's still wearing a top hat, even though he is in his buckskins. He and the president of KHS, who was dressed as Daniel Boone, walked arm in arm through the gates of the reconstructed fort and led the procession in. And so I'm assuming this was the day before as he's doing his final dress rehearsal and try-on. We did a little exhibit on the history of state parks at the Filson last year, and we had this blown up to life size on the back wall of the exhibit, and everybody said, "Oh, why'd you have to shrink him?" And I said, "No, we didn't. It's just a little hobbit." He also, and there's really great material. We led a Filson bus tour last year out to some pre-Revolutionary War sites in Missouri and Illinois, and we stopped on our way back in Vincennes, Indiana, where there's that large George Rogers Clark memorial temple. And Thruston was a driving force behind that. We've got lots of his personal material from the fundraising campaigns for that, the planning of that now, which is a national park site, and the dedication of there. He leaves significant financial resources to the Filson upon his death, the core of which now is our historical acquisitions endowment. So the money that we at the Filson use to purchase new collections, if art or papers come up on the auction market, we're able to buy those. And that the seed of that endowment was left by Mr. Thruston. We also use that to conserve anything. So if paintings are in bad shape and need to go off for conservation, or paper needs to be stabilized and restored, we've got the funds to do that. And that is entirely through his gift. He also left a very significant gift of his own papers and research material that rounded out our library. A couple of other interesting facts about his death in his obituary, sort of much like Jenny Chin Morton, there are some seeds that make you raise some eyebrows. There were some whispers about how that gift that he left to the Filson might have been a little bit larger had he not been so generous with freely providing for a number of young bachelors that came in and out of his life. And he, upon his passing, his funeral was held at the Pearson's Funeral Home, which was at 1310 South 3rd Street, which is where the Filson is now, after we moved from Breckenridge Street. Also important in the story of the Filson and of Kentucky history, writing and publishing generally, is Otto Rothert. He's about a half generation younger than Thruston. He'd been born in the early 1870s, and as his name might suggest, Rothert is not exactly a long-established Kentucky name. He's the son of German immigrants who come over in the 1850s. They eventually get established in banking, primarily in southern Indiana, and I love this portrait of him from the late 19-teens. We've got 4 or 5 portraits of Otto Rothert hanging around the office, but this one is right up the stairs as you come into our main curatorial offices, and it's my favorite there, backed up with all of his publications. And his cigarette, importantly, he was always said to be smoking, just constantly. But he's a weird character. There's so many funny stories about him. And he always said, well, I don't inhale, so it doesn't do me any harm. So, backed by his family's banking fortune, he kind of bounces around and never quite makes much of himself. His longest tenure in most of the things that I can read about him, and Hamilton Tapp, the Kentucky historian, who was even younger still than him, who got to know Otto Rothert as an older man, wrote a bunch of really hilarious stories about when he was a kind of a late teenage and early 20-year-old clerk at the Galt House, who kind of kept a tab on all of the scandalous activities that may or may not have been happening with elite social Louisville. And he was, very uniquely poised, unlike most of the staff, to go and participate in some of those shenanigans after his shift ended. But eventually, after kind of sowing his wild oats, he settles down in Muhlenberg County, where his family owned a small piece of property. And he really does seem to have taken to that place. He sort of, thinking about kind of a young Teddy Roosevelt, perhaps, kind of throws himself into the work of this farm down there and gets to know the people of Muhlenberg County and finds in them some kindred spirits. And he writes a really important history of Muhlenberg County that still stands up as the go-to reference that if I'm looking at anything on the county in the 19th century, it's the place to go because he knows everybody. And that really ignited his passion for Kentucky history. Particularly, he was obsessed with the old iron furnaces that were scattered throughout. There, of course, Muhlenberg County, even today, is known for all of its coal mining. So there are rich mineral resources in that part of western Kentucky. And on their property, they had the ruins of an old furnace that had been operated by the Buckner family. Simon Bolivar Buckner's father owned that, worked that iron furnace with enslaved labor. And so not only because of that Muhlenberg County connection does the Filson have the manuscript papers of the Buckner family, and particularly of the operations of that ironworks, but unfortunately, as he was poking around down there, we also had the human remains of some Native American mounds that he dug up from those same sites and put into our permanent collection, which over the past couple of years we have gone to a great deal of trouble and expense to comply with federal law and get those back home to the Cherokee. So that's where they are now, thankfully. He returns to Louisville in the early 19-teens, and from 1917 to 45, he is the secretary of the Filson, which meant that he was in charge of publications. Seeing the success of the Register that had been, again, established by Jenny Shin Morton in 1903 as a regular publication. It wasn't always quarterly, but it soon came to be a quarterly. Rothert argued that the Filson should stop producing book-length studies. So since 1884, the Filson had produced one book a year. And instead, he wanted to have a quarterly journal that would come out and allow more authors to be featured. And so he established in 1923 the Filson Club History Quarterly, which continued on to the year 2000 when it merged with some publications in Ohio and became Ohio Valley History. So a really important legacy that his work at the Filson left the entire state. Very few states are blessed to have two top quality research journals, and it really was having those venues where at any given quarter you could have an average of 6 new articles on Kentucky history coming out. There's an absolute outpouring of research on this state that we're still benefiting from, and still I consider it a great pleasure to have edited both the Register and Ohio Valley History, and I love even doing the research for this. It allowed me to go back into the archives and read some back issues, and that was just a really good treat. Unfortunately for Mr. Rothert, the Great Depression did not do good things for his family's bank in southern Indiana, and he, in an effort to kind of shore up some of his brothers, even devoted a number of his own resources to try and save the bank. It didn't work, and he kind of lived in great poverty in Louisville in some rundown apartments on the west end of downtown, and had a rather difficult life, and eventually after World War II, when he retired, moved down to Muhlenberg County just because the cost of living was a little bit more reasonable. And for that reason, kind of stayed out of touch with Kentucky history for the last decade of his life, where he probably could have written a number of other books. He was kind of known to wistfully reflect about his youth and go, but I had money then. Up through all of the years that the Filson was on Breckenridge Street in the backyard, their largest fundraiser of the year was the garden party. And this is the garden party for 1932. And this is the staff photo that kind of talks about I think the staff that Thruston and Rothert were able to assemble. The women in the middle are all trained archivists and librarians, some of them with degrees from the most prestigious universities and programs in the country, particularly the University of Wisconsin. Ludi B. Kincaid, who's in the back row there, kind of in the center, her name is all over our accession records and Kentucky history publications as well. All of these women, I would like to point out, much like Jenny Chen Morton and Sally Jackson, need a whole lot more credit and research to dig into their contributions to Kentucky history, because they are often the ones who are bringing in, cataloging, describing those manuscript collections that are going out to those researchers, and their names often do not end up on or in those books, but they're hugely influential. So also another lady who's not shown in this photo is one of the board members. She never did come onto staff, but Mary Verhoff was one of a pair of sisters from, again, a German family in Louisville who never married and were involved in a whole range of progressive era causes, from suffrage to children's education, animal welfare and rights. But Mary Verhoff was the chair of the Filson's Collections Committee for decades, and often in the pre-Thruston era used her own funds to purchase and conserve collections that are now fundamental to research at the Filson. We were actually really lucky a couple of years ago. A whole trunk full, literally, of documents from Mary and Carolyn Verhoff emerged out of the woodwork in Maine at an auction. And because of Mr. Thruston's Historical Acquisitions Endowment, we were able to purchase those and bring those back here. They are not fully cataloged yet, but in a forthcoming issue of Ohio Valley History, we've got the first article that's going to come from that purchase. It's about their activity in the ASPCA for animal rights. So I'm really excited about the research there. Likewise, Rothert and Thruston, we're only just getting to the point where we can tell their stories more fully. Both of them left significant personal paper collections as well as huge research paper collections at the Filson. Those have by and large not been touched or cataloged over the years. We just got a new donation of Rothert material in a couple of years ago, primarily Muhlenberg County research materials from his work on the book, and then subsequently that ended up in Lexington. I think the book thieves there around J. Winston Coleman and Tom Clark and all had something to do with those ending up there. But we were able to get those and are going to start cataloging work on them. And Mr. Thruston's papers also are on the slate later this year for a pre-processing and things like that. So if we had Dan Gifford here talking about the first volume of Filson and Kentucky public history, stay tuned in a few years once we get those collections cataloged, because the next one's on the way. I did just want to end very quickly by sort of saying that as we wrap this up, again, this group of individuals here all retires, at the mid to late 1940s, and then both KHS and the Filson enter a sort of a different professional era after the war. But to lay these dates on top of some broader Kentucky history timeline, mentioning Thomas D. Clark. In 1931, he joins the faculty at UK. In 1933, UK established its library science program, which is still active today. My wife's a graduate. In 1936, Tom Clark came over to the old state capitol and rescued a bunch of the state administrative papers from mildew and damage that he thought were being neglected. Those go to UK. A lot of those end up now at KDLA. 1949, the University of Kentucky Press begins publishing, and then in 1969 that got converted into the University Press of Kentucky Consortium, where KHS, the Filson, all the state universities, and some of the privates are all now members. And then we don't see another big leap forward until the end of the 20th century. Again, lots of this due to the groundwork laid by these individuals, but also the advocacy of Dr. Clark. 1982, the KDLA building is built. 1986, the Filson moves from Breckenridge Street into the Ferguson Mansion, where Mr. Thruston had his funeral. In 1999, of course, a city block down that way becomes the Thomas D. Clark Center for Kentucky History at KHS. So, I think all of these people are really worthy of study and attention. Professionally, these are the people that built all of the organizations that I work in, and as you Kentucky history supporters and patrons have a lot to understand and thank for these folks. So we got a few minutes left for questions. I'll take them now if you got them. Yes, ma'am.
Did Ed Thompson remain pro-slavery all his life?
That's an interesting question. He's pretty conservative on most of his politics. He teaches, I don't have a good read on him and race in the 1870s, except a couple of data points. He's a private school teacher for a number of years. He runs a boarding school for boys in Owen County and edits their Democratic newspaper. I've not read that paper yet, but if it even still exists. But I will just say that around the same time, Owen County is one of the most Klan-infested places in this Commonwealth, and I don't think that's coincidental. Yes, and he, I also paid a great deal. Now, of course, in his histories of the Orphan Brigade, he writes the first Kentucky Brigade in 1868. He revises and expands that into the history of the Orphan Brigade, which is 1,000+ pages. My mic go out? Right? Anyway, I'm yelling. So he expands that. There are some aside comments that say that he was pretty unreconstructed on the belief that slavery should have been defended. Especially in his 1868 edition, he sanitizes that a little bit. There's less political content, interestingly, in the 1898 edition, which I think is kind of telling and remarkable. He also writes he writes about 10 pages of an anti-U.S. Grant biography. And his brother was in publishing in St. Louis. Of course, Grant has in-laws in St. Louis. And as Grant's running for president in 1860, the Democratic sort of influencers in the Midwest want a hit job on U.S. Grant. They want this biography to come out and kind of tank this candidacy. And Thompson writes it because his brother is connected to this publishing house in St. Louis that's going to put it out. And he writes maybe, I don't know, a handful of pages, and it's all about how awful U.S. Grant's father is. And don't get me wrong, U.S. Grant's father is an absolute scoundrel. He's a grifter. He's a con man. He cheats everybody and anybody. And also owns slaves here in Kentucky, right? And that's also undeniable. But it's interesting that Thompson in those pages, which never even see print, we've only got them because they're just in his notebook that's at the Filson. He never condemns Grant for owning slaves necessarily. But he condemns the way that he managed his slaves, right? This is sort of this patrician paternalist. If you're gonna do it, you do it right, like a Southern gentleman, not like this Yankee scoundrel who just moved in here. So interesting data point. Right.
Patrick, you mentioned that for a time there was a book was done every year. Are those oversized?
Yes.
Unbound. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And some of them, they're really incredible.
Yeah.
Publications. They started in 1884 with Durrett's history of John Filson, and that's why they named the club after the first historian of Kentucky who interviews Daniel Boone and kind of makes him an international celebrity. So it was the story of that, which is a really forward-thinking biography of an author, but also sort of the reception history of this book that travels internationally and gets translated into all kinds of European language and all sorts of interesting things. Really forward-looking kind of work. The best one, brag on John Mason Brown for a little bit because I know my audience, is his book that he writes on the early political history of Kentucky, particularly kind of stepping back and trying to take a more, or perhaps a less biased interpretation of the Spanish conspiracy in James Wilkinson. And to do that, to his immense and everlasting credit, John Mason Brown, who had been to Yale and of course as a gentleman knew French and Greek and Hebrew and all of the classical languages, taught himself Spanish because he knew he had to read Spanish colonial archives to do this. And sort of in our modern world today, I'm holding that up as the Filsonian to emulate, right? Find out what you don't know and push yourself real hard to be able to write the story that you need, not the story that you can.
And have any of those been republished?
They are public domain.
Okay.
You can, it's one of those, they're public domain, so you can have a copy republished if you want to, but they're all on HathiTrust or Google Books or archive.org or wherever you want to go find them.
And your audience might be interested that Mary Berghoff did a book on the Kentucky River.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah, there are a couple of female authors in that series that come in the teens. That's a really good point. I'd forgotten that. Thank you.
Robert did a wonderful book on, what is it, The Devils of Cave-In Rock?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all the river pirates there. Yeah, well, absolutely. He's a great storyteller.
Mr. Thruston.
Yes.
How is he related to Senator Thurston B. Martin?
Yes, they are. I don't remember offhand, but they are closely related. He did not have children, but they're from. You go up and down the family tree, and they're right there together.
He's out at family.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was interested in Mr. Durrett. What was his relationship with the Durrett family that owned the property off of Preston Highway?
Mm.
They had given or sold, I don't know when, property to build Durrett High School,
Mhm.
now Louisville Mail.
Mhm.
But was there a relationship between those two?
Yes, they are related. You went to Durrett, didn't you?
Yes.
We were talking about Durrett High School on Tuesday. I'm going to defer to Michael.
I'm saying is he's just one of the brothers.
Yeah.
One of the brothers? Well, when you talked about his book collection, I taught in Louisville for a couple of years, and while I was there, I accidentally got to tour the Durrett home.
Oh, it was still standing.
Pardon?
It was still standing. Because I know they tore it down in 1968.
I'm so sorry to hear that. It was a three-story building. It had a three-story hall mirror
Whoa.
in the house that was brought over by ship
Wow.
and arrived in one piece. I think that's phenomenal.
That's incredible.
But anyway, because I accidentally went there, this was after whatever the current Mr. Durrett was had passed away. And his housekeeper still lived in the house. And according to his will, until the estate was disposed of, she had the right to live there as long as she wanted. So they had to wait on her to make a decision. But I knocked on the door and I said, "Is this where the tour's going to be?" And she said, no, that was yesterday. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I wanted to see that." "Well, come on in." So I got a brand new
You got a better tour.
house. But the most impressed that I was is when we got up to the third floor. I'm not sure if it was Mr. Durrett's bedroom or if it was just a room upstairs, but it had shelves all around. And in that room was a first edition Encyclopedia Britannica. And I said, "Oh." I said, "Can I take one off the shelf?" And she, "Oh, yeah, go ahead." So I actually put my hands on the first edition. But as I said, accidentally there, but I was just curious. And he, in his backyard, Mr. Durrett played with plants, and he had a greenhouse, and they compared him to Luther Burbank and said that he was the local version. And she said, "I don't know what he did out there with all those silly things." But she evidently had been with him for a very, very long time.
A peculiar family.
And the interesting thing is she still cooked in the fireplace of the original kitchen. And the fireplace was at least a person and a half high. And it had all these iron things that you could hang pots, where you could prop skillets. And when she stood in front of the fireplace opening was taller than she was. So it was an impressive fireplace, and she still cooked it.
Well, let me give you a few postscripts to that since I'm along the high school there. The last steward who was living there was a man named William Durrett, and I've heard lots of stories about him from some of the people that lived in the neighborhood. And I think he was an actor for a while. And then he lived in the house after all the other family members had died. Lived in the house without air conditioning, without electricity.
Exactly.
And,
well, without electricity, I didn't realize that.
And he was often seen going through the neighborhood apparently he was a very tall gentleman, and so he kind of stood out, you know, when you saw him walking in Preston Street or that. And he had lived there during the 1917 flu outbreak. You can't exactly tell it, which their hospital was maybe 200 feet from the Durrett's house. And I think he had something to do with helping care for some of the patients that they had at that time. Now today, the property is just, it's the middle high school soccer field.
Where the house was?
Yeah, that's
Oh,
where the
what a
house.
shame.
It was that close to where the school was actually built, because I would have teachers refer to that, you know, tell us what was out there, because it would have been right next to the tennis courts then. But there was nothing remaining by the time I got to school there. And about the stuff that Mr. Durrett was growing out in his yard, supposedly a lot of that stuff came from Samuel Churchill, who also owned a plantation a little further in near Preston Eastern Parkway. And Mr. Churchill was kind of a, what would you call him? Kind of a plant connoisseur, but he had his own orchard on his property. And he grew a lot of kind of exotic things and that. And supposedly, some of those made their way out to your property. But the official thing is that a lot of them were sent to the University of Chicago. And they kept samples or seeds of that. So there was that kind of kinship, I think, between the Durretts and the Churchills, because they had interest in agronomy or just growing things like that.
Is that where St. Joseph's would be?
Right across the street from St. Joseph Infirmary.
Yeah.
All right. In fact, the Churchill Mansion ended up becoming a bed and breakfast during the 1930s. There was a family named Hancock that owned the property at that time. And they would often offer rooms there for guests or for visiting doctors or that. But then sadly, that property burned down in 1965. Because I would hear stories about it when I went to grade school, which I went to grade school about a block from there, and I lived about 2 blocks from where that property was. And I'd always hear people talk about, oh yeah, the old farmhouse up there burned in 1965.
Yep.
And that was the Samuel Churchill plantation, and the mansion, which was built, I think, in 1804. At one time it was considered one of the oldest homes still standing in Louisville, and it burned down.
All right, we got a couple more in this row, yes.
My grandfather, Guy Van Sant, was a big member of the Filson Club. He passed on this really incredible Bible to my father. My father passed away several years ago and never showed me the Bible. I just found it about 5 years ago. And it's got a genealogy in there that's amazing. It's got a gentleman named Lieutenant Colonel Claiborne Rice Mason, who was a pretty famous Confederate general. And he built the bridges for Stonewall Jackson. I'd like to share that with you because I don't think I'm the only one to see his genealogy.
Yeah.
It's about 3 pages.
That is
It's
Did
got-
you say Flavor Rice Mason?
Yes,
The C.R. Mason?
Yes.
Mason and Hope,
yes,
now Mason and Hanger.
yes. He started, Claiborne Rice
All
Mason
railroads.
started Mason and Hanger. He built the Grand Coulee Dam, and Mason and Hanger were one of 4 firms that worked on the aqueducts in New York City. Probably the most incredible story. I've got the whole genealogy. And I've been trying to figure out what to do with it now.
Well,
Inspiration strikes.
I'm in contact with Mason and Hanger. Right now, they're working on a 200th anniversary
Well, I saw sure with you too.
history. So, yes, they would be interested, I'm sure, in talking to you as well. Patrick, do you, the early efforts to create the Historical Society in 1930s, or 1830s, talk about the Brown lineage, you had John Brown, Orlando Brown at the Old Capitol in that original meeting to create the Historical Society, and then of course you end up with Belinda Mason Brown with the Filson. It seems like there was not just an interest in documenting Kentucky's history when you go back from John Filson and Humphrey Marshall, but also by the 1830s there was also an interest in preserving the history of Kentucky's history.
Yeah.
So I know you've researched a little bit on state historical societies, so.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and a lot of what Kentucky is trying to do is to keep up with other states, particularly in the East, especially Virginia and Massachusetts. They're just always a step ahead. And we don't like that. So we don't like Massachusetts, and we feel inferior to Virginia. And we want to do it right, and we want to do it better. But it's really interesting, I thought too, thinking about that. And then by the time that we're talking about, when we've got all these characters, then you've got, Lyman Draper has sort of sucked all the energy out of the room towards Madison and the Wisconsin Historical Society and the University of Wisconsin, and he's gone around for decades and been interviewing all the pioneers, and he's got all of his notes, and everybody's mailing him things, and all these Kentucky families, and all this stuff's gone up there. And so there's a lot of kind of like, wait a second, if we don't do this, it's going to go. It's going to leave the state. I think it's also kind of telling that, while this is, this is kind of Kentucky's maybe highest moment of national prominence on its slow and steady decline after the Civil War, around the turn of the century here, particularly in Louisville, just because of the railroad and river travel. There is this recognition that people are moving away, and these new transportation opportunities are driving, Kentucky children off across the country, and there has to be some kind of protective and pride-building thing. This ties in with, and I know I wasn't at Dan's presentation, but if he was here, he talked a lot about the Columbian Exposition in Chicago as this big moment in the history of history organizations and the American Historical Association, museums for a bunch of different states, and Kentucky included. So those are real big moments of sort of instilling pride. Some of the other ones in St. Louis and Philadelphia are also particularly important as national forums where states are kind of trying to compete with one another, and even studying the history of the Southern Exposition, which was in Louisville, just down the street from where the Filson is now, and is now St. James Court. Go walk around down there on some nice spring afternoon like I do on my lunch breaks and look at all the houses. But imagine that to be a huge fairground in the 1880s. That is also a site of kind of different states, particularly in the South, trying to kind of vie for professionalism. In one of my other projects, I studied the history of a Confederate memoir by a guy named Sam Watkins called Company H. You all might have read it. It was also in the Ken Burns Civil War documentary. He was one of the characters that reads kind of consistently through. And he's from Columbia, Tennessee, south of Nashville, but he is up in Louisville at the service and support of the Tennessee Historical Society, hawking his books and trying to promote Tennessee history and making sure that Kentucky's not stealing all the limelight at the Southern Exposition, which I find really fascinating. One of the other interesting things that I did not talk about, but I found really interesting as Jenny Chin Morton is trying to get KHS established. And she, again, comes out of this elite women's lineage society world, and that kind of makes sense to her in a lot of ways. And there was initial talk of, should KHS be for only native-born Kentuckians? And should we open it up? So there had to be this kind of belonging aspect in this deeper sense that's a little bit more akin to the SAR or the DAR or the Colonial Wars or whatever your lineage society of choice is, instead of these more kind of open, anybody that's here now and interested can come in and join. But there, again, what I find most fascinating are these forks in the road moments, right? Where what we take for granted today, and all the places that you can drive and research Kentucky history, they could have sort of spun off and done something very different. And we talked a lot about when Dan was writing his book about the early Filson, if it's not for somebody like Durrett, and especially somebody like Thruston, to come back and really pick it up in that second generation. You know, the Filson could have just kind of kept puttering along and been a kind of a history-themed supper club. You know, like in Louisville, Salmagundi and Conversation Club are still meeting. They're about the same rough contemporaries of the Filson of when they get started. You know, it could have just sort of kept on going like that and been a venerable old institution, but now the Filson has the papers of both those organizations.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry I came in late, but Thruston, the headquarters for Sons of the American Revolution is in Louisville.
Yeah.
And Kentucky SAR, all goes back to Thruston. The Louisville chapter.
Main chapter.
It's the Thruston chapter because all their meetings were at his house.
Yeah.
And he paid for all the food.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got so much of his, and this is actually one of the reasons that his papers have not been cataloged yet, is because there have been various starts and stops, and there are two big questions. One, where do his personal papers start and Filson institutional records begin? And on the other side, where do his sort of research projects that were only of interest to him personally or to his SAR activities stop and start, and Filson research materials begin and end? And for Rothert, the same question, where do his personal research papers on, say, Muhlenberg County start and stop, and then hand off with his secretary of the Filson duty records? And so for those reasons, there have been various attempts over time to catalog Mr. Thruston's records, and we kind of just gave up because it got hard. And so that's why, despite his critical importance, we've not really pulled this apart. But one of the things that we're trying to do right now is for the SAR, he had all of these little miniature American flags made at God knows what kind of expense, hundreds of them. And it's basically a history of the United States through flags. And there's this whole curriculum, and he would give this presentation or give it to other SAR members, and they would take it out to schools and Boy Scout groups and you name it, and kind of show off all these mini flags and talk about the different, this one was used in Vermont, right, and all these kind of things. And so now we have boxes and boxes and boxes of these reproduction flags that are of not great use to us, because
I'll have Ray call you. She would love to have.
yeah, right. So they're just these kind of questions about where do these activities kind of lead. But yeah, it's real fascinating.
That would be great for your museum.
Yeah, wouldn't it though? Because it speaks to, that's the thing, you don't want to get rid of them because they speak to something important that was adjacent to us, but also like, we don't really need that. Yeah, that's a good point. John.
Just a comment and a question, actually. You can comment on either. But the comment is just how I always thought it was interesting when I first started learning the kind of meta history of Kentucky, how when John Mason Brown died in 1790, one of the Marshall descendants, I think it's Quisenberry, is ready to release his rebuttal to the political beginnings of Kentucky, which just goes back to this old Brown-Marshall feud that's been going on since like 1789. And Durrett sends a letter, I think, it's just like, it's over. Like, just let it, finally let it rest. Like, and also I think if you ever read Quisenberry's history, it's just full of typical Marshall attacks in that way where Durrett's like, that's not really history. You know, like, we're moving beyond that. You're not here to just defend your family, you need to be objective. And the man literally went to Madrid to try and clear all this up. You know, I think he did as well as he could do. But my question is a little bit after, because you were talking about how KHS was kind of established in the, not the original generation, but the old state capital generation, 1910s and 20s. And I was actually just reading this week how in 1905, when they decided to build the new Capitol, and then they fought over where it would be, and finally decided it would be in South Frankfort, the Ennis family, descendants of the Ennis family, threatened and I think sued, definitely threatened lawsuit, I haven't found all the papers yet, that they would inherit the land where the old state capitol is because they gave it under the promise that the capital would always be there. And this happens in like 1906, And there's this big, there's a lawyer in Seattle, and he's gathering all these descendants. Wow. And I didn't know if you knew or ever heard anything about, is that why they decided to keep the KHS there? Was the state like, no, we have to keep it some sort of state property? Obviously the architecture, like they're going to try to preserve it, maybe. but also it was a time when they were tearing a lot of stuff down.
They were, yeah, and I was browsing through some newspaper archives just this week, trying to kind of refresh myself for this a little bit, and some of the descriptors that are being thrown around about the old state capitol are not kind architecturally and as condition reports, and in fact, I saw one piece where Jenny Chin Morton was arguing to retain it, and I think, you know, eventually perhaps to move back there one day, though I think she was really proud of having rooms in the new state capitol. But she was making the point that a lot of the slander that had been thrown at that building for being decrepit and small and falling down and, you know, rotting on the inside and all of these kinds of things had been political arguments to invest the money to build a new one, but those weren't actually reflective of the actual condition of the building. And so, like, let's not get carried away. It was nice if we wanted to say that this building was in terrible shape and we needed a new one, but let's also not actually take ourselves too seriously and recognize that, like so much political speech, it's overblown to make your point, but actually don't take that seriously, because I want to make my next point about you know, having a place for celebrating Kentucky history and architecture. There's some really interesting photographs that I did not include that I thought about doing. That are on KHS's website in the photo collections of that kind of derelict period where, you know, there's just this empty and over in the old state capitol, and there's, you know, sheets over the remaining furniture that's there, and a handful of portraits are still up on the walls, and it's kind of exactly as you imagine. There are some like soot stains where they've moved something off the wall in one place and things like that. It's pretty wild to think that, like, that was a real possibility that might not happen. Well, I've kept y'all long enough. I'm gonna hand off the mic.
Dr. Lewis, please give Dr. Lewis a round of applause. Appreciate you coming. And I do obviously want to let you know about Dan Gifford's book, and there's I think we still have the link on the website to purchase his book on the Paul Sawyer Library's website. And I do want to let you all know next Tuesday is another pop-up lecture. Our very own Russ Hatter came out with his new book, Franklin County Reference, and he will be giving us a presentation on that and have the books here to sell and to sign for you all. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you hopefully Tuesday. Thank you.